Committee, so it's good to be back.
Yes.
With us, of course, is Chris Glass, the director of the West Michigan Talent Triangle, and our lobbyist, Rusty Merchant from McKelvey Merchant Associates. Chris has got, we're going to start out with the legislative update, and I'm just going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to walk through this PowerPoint. And between Chris, Rusty, and I, we may tag team this one a little bit.
All right.
Chris, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, members of the committee. I have some slides here I want to share that hopefully will put some structure to what's happening between Washington and Lansing right now. And sometimes when we present a legislative update, there isn't very much good news. And I would say that within this, there are some strands of good news that do give districts some certainty as we go forward. So I will share my screen now. Hopefully everybody's able to see that.
Awesome. Yep.
Okay. So the first thing I want to do is bring attention to what is really a needed course of action, and that's what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's very rare in today's state that you see the Republican-controlled Senate and the Democratic-controlled House both agree on providing additional aid for public schools across the country, and yet nothing is still happening on that front. And what I want to make sure folks are aware of is for a long time, we've been calling for two things from our partners in Washington, D.C. First and foremost, additional flexibility with federal funds that have already been put forward for K-12 education. But secondly, we know that additional aid is needed if we're going to mitigate budget reductions down the line. And so, unfortunately, the school negotiation, although there was agreement in providing additional funds, there were so many other items that were added to the negotiating table that the talks broke down before they left for an extended break. And as we know now, there are other issues, whether it be with the post office, whether it be with extended unemployment benefits, all of those things are clouding what is an agreed upon solution for funding for schools. And so they're not expected to be back until mid-September. Leadership can convene earlier and have a session if there is agreement. But as of right now, I haven't heard of that occurring besides the House coming back to deal with the post office issues. So what do we have out there? The first thing I'll bring your attention towards is the HEALS Act. This is the acronym that describes the Senate Republican proposal. And what it provides for K-12 education is $70 billion in total. This money would be divided across our country, 60% based on population, 40% based on the Title I formula. The initial allocation that we received in April from the federal government had a more significant weight towards the Title I formula. But based on my calculations, if approved, Michigan would receive roughly $2.25 billion under this proposal. One key characterization, this proposal does provide aid to both public and private schools. And as it sits right now, receiving 2/3 of that aid would be contingent on being open for in-person instruction. And that definition of in-person instruction is defined as half the students for half the time. So there are some restrictions placed on these resources that would be provided if this were to become law. So for several months now, the HEROES Act passed the House of Representatives in Congress and moved its way to the Senate. And what we saw in there was $58 billion for K-12 education, a very similar distribution formula. And because it is a lesser amount, Michigan's allocation for that would be roughly $1.86 billion. Unlike the Senate proposal, this has no restrictions on the funding. It's pretty much wide open. And there are no resources allocated for private schools within the Democratic proposal. So that's the Washington update. We're going to continue to be in conversation with our federal delegation. It was our strongest hope that if the federal delegation were to act and provide additional aid for schools, it would really be the missing piece of what we're going to see coming out of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. We'd have a much better picture of what tax collections look like in the state of Michigan. We'd have a much better picture of what resources we're going to receive from Washington. And all of that would fit together nicely to give a more clear picture of what we're working for the budget. So the unfortunate part of that is I think we're going to have to begin the budget conversation in Lansing prior to knowing what aid we're going to receive from Washington, D.C. as it sits now. So that really turns us into what is the incredible uncertainty for schools. As we know, this pandemic has created the perfect storm for uncertainty in school budgets. Many districts are fearful that enrollment is significantly in flux due to parental concerns surrounding safety and learning options for their students. And we also know, because tax revenues, there's a big question mark there, the per pupil is in flux. And so that makes it very difficult to have an accurate budget. And if you don't have an accurate budget, it makes it very difficult to provide the needed services for kids. So in a little bit of good news, in May, we had a consensus revenue estimating conference. Typically, the May consensus revenue estimating conference is what sets the final budget targets by which the budget is negotiated and then put into law. Well, what we saw there was a significant downward revision in the amount of revenues the state was expected to receive. There was a great deal of uncertainty during that consensus revenue estimating conference because we were in the early stages of the pandemic. We were in the early stages, a lot of the executive orders that were put in place that really restricted our economy and the movement of people. And so economists did their best to predict where we would be at. Well, now that we've had a longer run of time, what we've seen is that revenue and tax collections are in fact outpacing what the May predictions were. So we were expecting roughly a $3.1 billion budget hole for fiscal year 21. They're now predicting it's going to be a roughly 1.5 billion, and 800 million of that would be for the school aid fund. So we never like to see numbers in the red, but these are not as significant as we saw in May, and we're hopeful that things continue to trend in the right direction. On Monday, we're going to see, or on Tuesday, we're going to see the consensus revenue estimating conference on August 24th. And that, I believe, will be the final numbers of which the budget negotiations will stem from. So that will be important to see what that consensus is coming out of that meeting. You may have heard some chatter in Lansing about a legislative proposal that was negotiated between the governor, the Senate, and the House. There were many aspects to this legislative proposal, and I want to give some perspective here for the school districts. Earlier, I talked about needing certainty as it pertains to budgets. Well, one of the key components of that is how do we know how many students we're serving, or what is that pupil count? And one of the things that Lansing was able to do was to give us more certainty as it pertained to the pupil count or the number of students we're serving for budgetary purposes. The positives of this package that the governor is expected to sign is that 75% of our funding is based on last year's student count. The vast majority of districts all across the state are experiencing declining enrollment to some degree. And so in essence, this is providing more support for more pupils within the system, which ultimately provides more stability. The final 25% is going to be based on enrollment for this upcoming year. Another issue that we had concerns with, our current rules and regulations are not adequate for the various models of instruction that are going to be provided out there. And what do I mean by that? The state, as it sits right now, cannot recognize many school districts' plans to return to school and therefore fund them as a result of providing education to kids, whether that's through a hybrid model, whether that's through a virtual model, or some other form of that. And so this package did provide us some long-term certainty and flexibility on seat time and attendance rules so that districts can in fact count those as days of instruction and receive funding for doing so. The last thing to make you aware of on the positive column, we did advocate pretty aggressively for the suspension of the kindergarten readiness assessment. This assessment involves a lot of observation, involves a lot of interaction between students and teachers, and from a public health perspective, just wasn't safe to execute. And then when we think about an observational assessment, when you're doing it virtually, it's just not as valid and reliable, and therefore didn't make a whole lot of sense to administer for schools. And so they did suspend that, which we advocated for and were thankful about. What are concerns? In order to get this flexibility, school districts are going to have to put together an additional plan, and boards are going to have to approve this. Furthermore, it's going to require monthly board approval to reconfirm the plan with the opportunity for public comment. And finally, it's going to require some additional reporting requirements as to how districts are doing as it pertains to goals that were set in the plan. These will be reported to the board and be uploaded on the transparency link on the school district's website. So the question naturally becomes, what's in the plan? First and foremost, it's a statement of why the plan is necessary. That could be summed up in one word: pandemic. And really, it's as simple as that. That's why we need to be able to have this flexibility. They're also asking for broad educational goals to be put in place for what the district expects to achieve. In order to measure those goals, they're requiring that districts administer a benchmark assessment. We know this has been common practice for GRPS and many other districts, and so there shouldn't be a whole lot of deviation from what is your current practice. They also want a description of how instruction is going to be provided. So as we know, there's been a determination in order for GRPS to start the school year virtually. So that's where you would put how that instruction will be provided. They want a description of how students will be exposed to academic standards. And so this could be through virtual classroom sessions with their teachers. This could be through learning management systems or where curriculum's already populated and students are accessing it with guidance from their teachers, things along those lines. And then another thing that we've already had to do last year is just an assurance that there's equitable access to technology for all learners that are going to be a part of that. A couple of other aspects to touch on. Description of how students with disabilities will be provided equitable access is also a part of it. They're looking for continued partnership with the local health department, which I know our superintendents have been deeply engaged with. And then if in-person instruction is provided, they want to make sure K-5 students are prioritized. As you might imagine, that is a significant childcare issue for a lot of families out there when in-person instruction does resume. It's just a thought or consideration that the legislature thought was important. And so what does it look like for attendance? Districts shall ensure that at a minimum, at least two-way interactions. That's kind of tough to say. It's a tongue twister. But two-way interactions per week are taking place, and that involves engagement within course content. So what does that look like? It could be engagement within curriculum through a learning management system. It could be a teacher convening all the students through a Zoom meeting and talking about course content or standards, and then a general attendance is taken at that time. There are some rules that have to be finalized here, but at the end of the day, all parties agree it should be pretty broad in nature, and we should try to limit the burdensome reporting and the red tape that goes along with documenting that students are with us and learning standards as they are intended to do. So with that, I'll turn it over to John, or I'll be happy to answer any questions, but that gives you a lay of the land. I do anticipate in fairly short order, the governor will put her signature on this bill. I do anticipate shortly after that, MDE will be providing additional guidance. And so as much as it's a little bit late in the game, at least it gives us some important certainty as we head into the school year, knowing we have a structure in place that's going to allow schools to deliver education and receive funding for doing so. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Chris. Great work as always. Are there any questions from committee members?
John and Chris, I'm curious about the 2/3, 1/3 funding proposal from the federal government. So if we at any point in the school year offer in-person instruction, are we then eligible for that remaining third funding, or how does that work with the half-time equation? To what length of time does that pertain?
Yeah, Jen, I think if Washington were to get back and really hammer out a negotiated settlement, that would be a significant point of difference, and it would look significantly different than what's proposed. There aren't a lot of details on what that looks like. And one of the concerns is, as you may imagine, what if there's just a large amount of student or parents that don't opt for in-person instruction? That's at no fault of the district, right? What if there's an outbreak within a school building or district, in which we hope doesn't happen, but that's at no fault of the district. And so I think they're going to have to soften that language. I think what they were responding to was what we've seen is kind of the politics of it. And there's a strong desire from the president and others to make sure everybody's in person. And I think we have to be respectful of localized context as it pertains to this pandemic, so districts can make those individual decisions. So I wish I had a specific answer for you, but I do think if it's going to pass, that's going to be one of the areas that's softened in Washington before it gets to us.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, along with what the governor revealed, I think it was 1.5 million that we would be getting. how does that relate to some of the HEAL and the HEROES Act or the negotiations from the federal end of it?
So
So
the
Reverend,
government,
this is, go ahead,
Sorry.
John, you
no,
want to
go
cover
ahead,
it?
Chris. No, you have more details, I think.
Yeah, so what I would say is the resources that we expect to be announced later today are a part of the initial CARES Act allocation that the state of Michigan received. There was $3 billion allocated to governors all across our country as an emergency education fund. Michigan's proportion of that was 89 million. We anticipate 60 million of that will be allocated for K-12. The remainder would go to higher ed, but there's a distribution that recognizes that students in poverty face additional hurdles and challenges, and districts need the resources to help them overcome that so that they're not missing a beat as it pertains to their academic journey. And so that's where we should see some final numbers later today, but I would anticipate districts like GRPS, based on their student makeup, will receive a good portion of those funds.
Okay.
And just so the other committee members, in case they may not have seen the email yesterday, there's a press conference today at 2:00 that Dr. Roby has been invited by Governor Whitmer to participate in, where they're going to be announcing these funds. We are anticipating about 1.5 million for Grand Rapids Public Schools that'll be targeted at our highest need, highest poverty students.
Chris, on the return to learn plan, just to make sure I'm clear, sounds like that's pretty much kind of established, but just not official, not signed, not rolled out yet. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the Senate acted on it on Saturday. The House acted on it on Monday. I suspect it's going to be from the clerk's office to the governor in fairly short order with her signature. Sometimes there's delays from the clerk to the governor, but they've all made public statements that they are supportive and they plan on signing that legislation.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming then when that's signed, in association with that, there would then be also a timetable established as far as when districts need to have such plan established.
Yeah, you need to have your academic goals established by September 15th.
Oh, okay.
And then you need to have board approval by October 1st.
Okay. Okay.
So that gives you your timeline. You know, there are going to be some hiccups within this language. It was a pretty significant negotiation when you think about all the different stakeholders who wanted to provide input, and you think about kind of the gap between Republicans and Democrats at times regarding school policy. So there really were a lot of what I would say real negotiating going on. And the language probably isn't perfect in some areas. As an example, it requires the board to reconfirm that plan every 30 days. We know that although you meet on a monthly basis, it's not every 30 days in every situation. And so we want to make sure that we can go back and clean some of that up to limit unnecessary, school board meetings and things of that nature.
And then that every 30 days piece, obviously if the plan was set to be finalized, I think you said like October 15th, we're really just talking September and then October sort of meeting or update, because we're not doing every 30 days after it's finalized or submitted.
You should expect to have this plan operational through your whole school year.
Oh, so still, okay. So they mean, okay. So the board sort of update is not an establishment of the district's plan, but it's also an establishment and observation or monitoring as well of the plan throughout the year. Okay.
Yep. There are some reporting requirements on our academic goals. There's also reporting requirements on the attendance, some information that we'll also have to post to our transparency page on the website.
If committee members will recall, part of the reason we're dealing with some of this, what I would call red tape, is the executive order that guided schools through the spring shortly after the pandemic. It didn't allow districts to, if students couldn't attend school, right, to take attendance and really implement any of those rules and regulations or school policies. It didn't allow grading. It didn't allow a lot of stuff. And so many districts, as they were scrambling to get their plans in place, there was this perception out there that they wanted to make sure what's happening in the fall is different than what was in the spring. And so this plan is their way of kind of checking those boxes. But Renard, the thing that I would point to with the plan is that although the district's plan is to start the school year virtually, you never know when you may have to shift gears. And what this plan does is allow you the flexibility from an attendance and seat time perspective to continue to receive state aid no matter what state we're in.
One other thing, do you have clarity when we're talking about this this board monitoring or updating or oversight, whatever the case? Is that a matter of a full board, or could that be at a committee level, be it academic achievement, or maybe in an ad hoc committee, or is that a full board thing, or do you know?
I believe the intent is the full board, but I'd have to view the language to see if there's any, semantics to that.
Yeah, I was thinking along those same lines, especially as if we're talking about a district showing their goals or the intent, hybrid, in class, or others. And right now, we're tending to look at the academic committee, some of that going to the academic committee, and as a way of vetting how we're doing our learning or intending to do that. So again, it's really critical to get public insight into how learning is going, distant learning is going from the home, because now parents are picking up a major part of what normally would be the teacher fielding academic questions from their students. Now parents are having to oversee that to a large extent, especially if technology is an issue with their own children and themselves. But how do we, when you look at the HEALS Act and then the heroes from the federal, right? What looks like it's gonna trickle down to us or even Michigan in terms of, the 2.2 billion and the 1.86 billion or something like that? What's the forecast of that looking like money-wise for our state?
Yeah, so the HEALS Act provided 70 billion.
Okay.
And 2.25 billion would go to Michigan. So a significant amount of money relative to even what we saw, right? The initial CARES Act gave us $389 million. So this would be significantly more than what we saw the first round. So Michigan's share would be 2.25 billion. Then it comes down to what the distribution is at the state level to be able to pinpoint where GRPS would fall in that. And also, I suspect there'd be some perhaps multi-year disbursements as opposed to 1 year. So it's difficult to track exactly at the local level how long that 2.25 billion would be expected to last, and then therefore how much at a local district level you should expect to receive at this point in time.
Okay.
And I guess the good news on that is that the Republican plan had more money in it than the House Democratic plan. But so we're somewhere between 58 billion to 70 billion, and somewhere between the 1.86 billion for Michigan and 2.25 billion. So hopefully that gives us an indication that we're going to be somewhere in that range. And then it's really a matter of them still fine tuning the details and how those funds get distributed.
Yeah, this Rusty. The only addition that I would say to that, John and Chris, is if our numbers are looking better, that may mean other states' numbers are looking better, and that may pare back what the feds do in terms of the amount. So if everybody's a little better, right, then they're going to look at it and say, well, maybe we only need to do 40 billion. So, I think sort of picking those two numbers as guideposts has a challenge to it, just if everybody's numbers are getting better.
Yep. That's a great point, Rusty.
And then Reynard, you're part of the finance, right?
Honestly, I don't remember, embarrassingly.
No, I mean, I guess,
though.
Yeah, just in terms of how
It's been so long, we haven't met in like 6 months, right?
we're catching up all kinds of ways. But just in terms of how would our committee suggest some of the ways that we might look at it budget-wise of what we need to compensate, especially if if either we continue distance learning and some other ways of helping cope, or suggesting ways that our district needs to develop ways of helping our parents cope, or teachers, with this combination of in class or out, and then and educating in this new way at this point. But how might we suggest some budgetary issues from the legislative standpoint? Or would we?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, we have I know that Dr. Roby has asked Larry Oberst to outline for the board all the different pots of funds that are available to us right now, complete with the restrictions and limitations and the strings that are attached. And so we will be bringing recommendations to the board on both with what dollars we have, as well as what we're recommending how to invest those dollars. There's quite a few of those funds, though, that we're still waiting for more clear direction as to what we can use those funds for. Some of them are funds that have to be spent by December 31st. So we are, we are working as fast as we can to figure out how we're going to invest those funds. You can imagine a fair significant amount will be in the technology, in the internet accessibility, the social emotional supports, and then obviously the PPE, the safety equipment. But we can. I'll follow back up with Dr. Roby to find out on the timing on that. But I do believe that that's going to go before finance and then before the full board.
And just to add to that, that was another disappointing aspect of the negotiations breaking down, because there was agreement, additional flexibility would be provided at the state level and the district level to expend those resources over a longer period of time and have more things qualify for what it could be spent on. And so that is in the discussion list in Washington. But again, if they don't act on an additional stimulus bill, it's going to be tough for them to go forth and give us that flexibility.
Yeah. And Chris, to your point you just made in the chat about getting public comment on the plan, we will be also sharing with the board our plans for the different feedback options. There will be student level engagement at the school-based level. There will be parent level engagement at the school-based level, as well as a district-wide community and parent engagement. So there will be staff as well. So parents, students, staff will be engaged in advance of the board vote in September on the plan.
Great.
All right. Are there any other questions? Hearing none, Mr. Chairman, may we move on to the next agenda item?
Yes, please.
All right. I put this on there just as a holding point, because our legislative platform, typically around this point in time is when we start to work on our legislative platform. To reiterate, you might recall we narrowed it down to really 5 key points. One was the funding formula, more equitable funding formula. I don't anticipate any changes to that. The expansion of the critical shortage list, educator evaluation, after-school programming, and then talent educator recruitment and preparation. At this point, I don't have any recommended changes. What I'd like to do is come back to you all next month. I'll get with Rusty and Chris, and we'll put together some recommendations for how, if at all, we may change the platform. Obviously, we're in a unique state here. We certainly need to continue and need to include the federal advocacy. If you recall, the previous platform, the 10-page platform that we significantly narrowed, does have federal advocacy and federal funding in there included. So I would argue that that is encompassed in our overall legislative committee priorities. But as we look to the development of our platform for this year, I'd like to come back next month and bring some recommendations to the committee. Good?
That would be good. Great.
Okay. The next agenda item, we didn't want to lose sight. This is also typically the time of year we start to plan for Capitol Day and our legislative lunch. Rusty, I know you had some ideas. We would like to at least get something on the calendar. It may obviously not be in person, so we might not be having lunch, but there's really no reason we can't plan ahead to schedule the lunch and what I don't know if we'll do a Capitol Day, but we could certainly do the virtual meetings. As Rusty has said before, we had a meeting with the Senate Majority Leader, with the Speaker of the House, and believe it or not, during this COVID situation, it's in some cases maybe even easier to get those meetings because you can do a quick 15-minute Zoom meeting. Rusty, you want to chime in?
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, John. So my suggestion is that we pick a day that we want to do this. We typically do it in April after spring break or early May when they're sort of in serious budget negotiations. And given that, hopefully in the spring, fingers crossed, we're in a little different situation than we are now. I would suggest that we pick a Tuesday or a Wednesday in the last 2 weeks of April, and we schedule it, get it on everybody's calendar, and we plan on doing it in person. And then we'll get we would get all the meetings that we would normally get and do all those things. And if we have to change it to remotely, then what we would do is schedule a 4-hour Zoom meeting. And as terrible as that sounds, I'll get to the rest of it, but a 4-hour Zoom meeting where in 15 to 20-minute increments, we would bring all the people that we were going to meet with into the Zoom meeting with some breaks and other things in place, and sort of get that done and make sure that we're connecting with folks. So I'm a glass half full guy. So I'm going to say, let's plan to do it in person, and then we'll adapt as we need to. It's because it's not like we need a big room in Lansing that we have to book or anything like that, because we normally have our board members and then we just go and do individual meetings. So that would be my proposal.
Sounds good to me.
That sounds good to me too. I've just been thinking about primary results, and were those results friendly to education? And then as a follow-up, just after November, do we want to do any sort of meet and greet with freshman legislators before April? As I'm sure they'll be making decisions about us before April.
Yep. No, that's that is a good suggestion. So just for the edification of all the group, I think we've got 27 open seats due to term limits. So you'll have 27 new members. I would also say that as opposed to prior years, there is a real question as to which party will control the House. I think it's sort of a 50-50 proposition at this point. It could go either way. So we could have a change in majority in the House, which is going to change the dynamic tremendously, both in policy and in the fact that the governor will now have 2 of the 3 legs of the stool. So, but again, last time the majority was decided in 3 state House races by a combined total of 1,100 votes. That's how close it was. 1,101 votes different, and you would have had an exact flip of the House from Republican to Democrat. So, if you break that down to precincts, it's not very many votes per precinct, I will tell you. So that's a real possibility. So what we would normally do is, and we'll have to do this electronically, we can get freshman members and do those sorts of things. So I think we can do that with the committee, certainly West Michigan based folks, but also who the new chairs would be and that kind of stuff, so that there's an introductory conversation.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, in terms of planning for April or May, for me, Wednesdays work better, and I'm sure that will chime in as to the times and stuff like that, and certainly for our meetings going forward, what we want to do there. But
okay. Noted.
All right. That's all we have for today. If there's are there any other questions or anything else for the good of the order?
John, I see on the agenda our meeting schedule, September through
Oh.
December. Do you want to talk about that?
Sorry.
Right.
Both Johns. Yes.
Yep. Sorry. Yeah. And apologize. I know we've struggled a little bit on these dates, and so what we'd really prefer is to schedule these on a Monday or a Friday. That way, Rusty and Chris can participate. And the legislature is in session typically Tuesday through Thursday. So, is there a preference of those 2 days and a preference of time that we could look at?
Monday afternoon is usually the least conflicting between the various meetings that are going on, whether that's in Lansing or there's a lot of community meetings sometimes Monday morning that require time and attention from me personally.
Okay.
And I think we were thinking noon to 1 or 1 to 2, right?
Yep. I'd suggest, I like the 1 to 2. That way we're not interrupting lunch for anyone. And do we want to say the third Monday? I'm just throwing that out. There's nothing that really stands out other than I just threw it out there.
1 to
Um,
2 works for me on the third Monday.
Yeah, for me, Mondays, really any Monday is flexible for me. Fridays are a little bit more cumbersome, but.
Okay, you know what? Yeah, and I'm just realizing that we have our executive cabinet at 1:00 on Mondays. Could we do, is 2:30 a possibility? Or I could noon to 1 actually works as well. If noon to 1 is better for you all, we could do noon to 1.
If you don't mind watching me eat a sandwich, then I'm fine.
Yeah, that's good for me. It's harder on that third Monday later into the day as I have our ABC board meetings the third Monday of the month.
What about the second Monday? Or the fourth Monday?
From noon to 1.
Yep.
Yes,
Either works
second Mondays for me work fine. Noon to 1, yep.
Works for me.
Mr.
Reynard?
Ross, you good?
Yeah, I'm kind of looking ahead now. And yeah, it looks like that should be okay for me. 12. So we're saying 12 to 1, second Mondays, beginning what are we talking? Beginning September?
Yep.
Mhm.
Okay.
So essentially, September 7th.
14.
14.
Okay.